Now, what comes to your mind when you hear the book Exodus? What comes to your mind? Maybe a mysterious talking burning bush? Or a baby boy in a basket floating down the Nile River by himself? Some maybe have pictures of Charlton Heston, his version of Moses. Or maybe you are thinking of Prince of Egypt, the cartoon, right? There's a variety of things that Exodus cues for us, especially if you grew up in the church or if you're a Bible reader. Now, in the Bible, Egypt is for sure a place, a country, a nation. And for the biblical authors as well, it is so much more than just a nation, a country, and a place. So Egypt in the Bible is a central place and a setting for where the foundational theological, that is, God themes, God stuff shows up in a big way. And everything that kind of shows up in Exodus begins to be actually repeated through the entire scriptures. The themes that we find in Exodus are repeated over and over and over. So the setting of Egypt is where we learn God's name. I am that I am. We learn how God acts. We see the rhythms of his actions, and we see how God's character and how he acts is continued through the Bible. So Egypt actually becomes a significant setting in the story of God. Egypt is something that's referred to throughout the Bible. And again, it's not referred to just because it was a nation and a place and a set time. There's much more going on here. So let's find out what's going on. Let's look at the first 7 verses of the book of Exodus, chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel, that is Jacob, who moved to Egypt with their father, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. In all, Jacob had 70 descendants in Egypt, including Joseph, who was already there. In time, Joseph and all of his brothers died, ending that entire generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. And so now Exodus, what it's doing for us is actually cueing to us that this is the continuation of that family, of that story. That's why it starts with Jacob, or as he was renamed, Israel. So Exodus continues 400 years later from Genesis, but it is a continuation. Okay, so that's the first thing the biblical authors want us to catch. The second thing they want us to catch is actually found in verse 7. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. Now, do you see the setting happening in this verse 7? The Bible is brilliantly pointing to something for us to notice. Now, we as modern readers can really miss it because we just don't necessarily think in repetitions in the same way. We don't think of settings in the same way. But this verse 7 is not a throwaway statement about the healthy libido of Israelites. It's actually a really significant verse connecting the readers to a setting. It's trying to remind the readers that as this story continues, this is a continuation of the setting we experience in Eden. But what the author wants us to catch here is that the setting, Egypt, is a setting that's working against the purposes of God. And this is shown particularly in the fact that Egypt is an empire built on the backs of slaves. Creation was all about sending us to be co-creators with God, partners in relationship with God, being co-creators with the creator of the whole universe. Egypt is the opposite of that. Built on slaves. And this is so significant to the story of God, friends. We can write books on just this one verse. So much so that I want to suggest when Egypt is mentioned in the Bible from now on, it represents this anti-Eden. A place where the anti-purposes of God exist. A place where it's anti-God's kingdom, anti-God's creation, anti-God's practices and rhythms. Egypt represents anti-Eden. And notice the repeating motifs again. as humanity's choices to define good and evil for themselves create more and more chaos, we find in the story that God is not distant, that God is not aloof, that God is not indifferent. We have seen it through the entire Genesis account, and now we see it in Exodus, this continuation that God always hears the cries of the oppressed. And we need to pause on this massive statement. God always hears the cries of the oppressed. As you look around your life, as you look around your world, your setting, that God's story does not want you to miss this. God always hears the cries of the oppressed. This reminder is trumpeted throughout the entire story of God as a reminder of God's character. God always hears the cries of the oppressed. God continually steps into anti-Edens to rescue, to redeem, to restore, and to renew. This is exactly the story Jesus is part of. God's character is who he is. It is centered on this reality that he hears and he enters into the suffering and pain of our lives. I want to just reaffirm that settings matter. Egypt is a place and a space, but it represents so much more. And the biblical authors don't want us to miss in ways that we can become so drawn away from God's purposes. So much so that we can even justify and rationalize something that is evil because it's working for us. Settings matter. They tell a story. They tell a story. What story does this setting tell? Our setting has a history. It has a present, and it has a future. What story will we tell when we hear of God's character, that God hears the cries of the oppressed? How will we respond? Anti-Eden results in death and graves. God's response isn't to be aloof, but to step into that anti-Eden, to step into that Egypt and to rescue. And then he invites his people to join him in the renewal of all things. Friends, he turns graves into gardens. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you that you hear the cries of the oppressed. We thank you that you do not become distant or aloof. We thank you that you turn graves into gardens. Amen.